It's the easy part.
Comprehension is the hard part, or what?
Now, Jock Francis, the salvage diver. Jock plunged into the sea and the cold engulfed him. It was so different to the warm waters where he'd learnt to swim and dive as a child. He took a series of deep breaths, allowing his lungs to inflate with air and take precious oxygen into his blood, and dived beneath the waves. As he reached the depths, he began to make out the shape of the wreck through the murky water. He had heard the tale of how this proud warship had met her doom. The men of the town didn't agree on exactly what had caused her to sink, but they well recalled the spectacle of her quick, cruel disappearance beneath the waves. The screams of the drowning men were loud enough to reach the shore. Their skeletons would be waiting for him among the sunken timbers. Hundreds of onlookers, including King Henry himself, had watched helpless as the ship went down. The Mary Rose, that was what they called her, and now that splendid ship lay lifeless before him in the water. Her side was studded with guns of iron and bronze, and the latter marked with the royal crest. That was why he was there, why the king had hired this master to salvage the expensive weaponry. The Venetian could not dive this deep himself, and so he'd found Jock and the other divers in his team, and brought them to his cold island to perform a miracle for the English king. Few of us know that there were attempts to salvage the Mary Rose in the Tudor period. Still fewer that some of the men qualified to undertake the job came from Africa. How did they manage to retrieve objects from the seafloor centuries before the invention of modern diving equipment? Why was it that Africans were so skilled in diving when most Europeans couldn't even swim? How did Jock Francis's expertise affect the way he was viewed and treated by Tudor society? Most of what we know about him comes from precious evidence preserved in the records of the High Court of Admiralty. Jock was the very first known African to give testimony before an English court. But how would his words have been received? Yes, he was an eyewitness, but according to the prosecution, he was also an infidel and a slave. Jacques Francis was about 18 when in 1546 he began working for a Venetian named Pier Paolo Corsi. Corsi, who had been in Southampton since about 1539, was one of a considerable though dwindling number of Italians based in the port. There had been a strong Venetian, Florentine, and Genoese presence in Southampton in the medieval period. The merchants of these powerful city-states had come there since the 13th century to satisfy northern Italy's demand for English wool. The wool trade was central to the English economy, its importance symbolized by the fact that since the reign of Edward III, the Lord Chancellor sat on the wool sack in the House of Lords as the Lord Speaker does today. As the geographer Richard Hakluyt put it in 1584, quote, "For hundreds of years, by the peculiar commodities of wool, and of later years by clothing of the same, England, and raised itself from meaner state to greater wealth and much higher honor, might, and power than before." End quote. Southampton was also the chief center for the export of Cornish tin, since Henry VII had established a staple or exclusive market for metals there in 1492. But by the 1540s, the port was in a terminal decline brought on by the increasing dominance of the capital, with fewer and fewer Italian visitors. Like John Blanc, Jacques Francis arrived in England before regular direct trade with Africa began. Francis was born in the 1520s on an island off the coast of the part of West Africa known to the Tudors as Guinea. We do not know the exact route by which he came to Southampton. Corsi may have hired him directly from Africa through a Portuguese intermediary, or perhaps they met in Corsi's home city, Venice. After Spain and Portugal, the next largest African population in Europe was in the collection of states that today make up modern Italy, of which Milan, Naples, and Sicily were ruled from Madrid after 1535. Most came via Portugal, the country that initiated the import of Africans into Europe in the 1440s. The trade partly financed by Italian investors. The largest number of Africans were in the south, especially in Sicily, but in the 16th century there was a growing presence in the northern cities of Mantua, Milan, Ferrara, and Corsi's Venice. This was where Isabella d'Este, Marchesa of Mantua, sent her agent in 1491 when she was looking for a girl, quote, as black as possible, end quote, to serve her. The presence of enslaved Africans in Venice was certainly a truism by Shakespeare's time. In The Merchants of Venice, circa 1596 to 1598, Shylock tells the Venetians, quote, "You have among you a purchased slave, which like your asses and your dogs and mules, you use in abject and in slavish parts, because you bought them." And of course, Othello was employed by the Venetian state. Although most Africans had arrived as slaves, some were manumitted and found employment. It was not uncommon to spot a free African in command of a gondola gliding along the Grand Canal beneath the Rialto Bridge. The first hereditary Duke of Florence, Alessandro de' Medici, was said to be the son of an African woman named either Simonetta or Anna, who may have been a former slave. At least one African had come to Southampton from Italy before Jacques Francis's arrival. In 1491, Richard Hortensell, beadle of God's House Hospital, was fined for his involvement in a fight with a, quote, black man that was a tavern in the galley of South End Hampton, end quote. This galley, a low ship powered chiefly by oars and favored in piracy and war, was probably part of the Florentine or Venetian state fleet, as both used Southampton as their English base at that time. The, quote, tabarin, end quote, was a drummer, a musician like the Scottish, quote, Moore Taub Ronar, end quote, or John Blanc, who would usually play alongside a piper, setting a beat for revelers to dance, or in this case, keeping time for the strokes of the oarsmen. In summer of 1545, England was under attack. 235 ships bearing 30,000 Frenchmen, spoiling for a fight, were on their way across the Channel. 2 years before his death, King Henry VIII was once again at war with the foe of his youth. His navy gathered at Portsmouth and set sail on a calm, sunny July day. The Mary Rose, one of the vessels leading the fleet. Henry had built this Mary Rose, built this four-mast, 400-ton battleship in the first years of his reign, and she had given good service, particularly in the sack of Brest in 1512. On the eve of better known 1513 victories at Flodden, and the Battle of the Spurs. After an extensive refit in 1536, the ship was ready to attack the French once more. Loaded with 91 guns and packed with some 500 men, she set out to meet the enemy in what has come to be known, before being largely forgotten, as the Battle of the Solent. Yet before she was able to engage the French, in fact, while she was still in full view of the harbor, the Mary Rose sank. As Jacques Francis would have heard from those recounting the tale, the piercing cries of the drowning men echoed across the water to the shore. Fewer than 30 men survived. The lack of wind had lulled the crew into a false sense of security. The sea was so calm that no one thought it necessary to close the gun ports before setting sail. When the wind suddenly picked up and the Mary Rose attempted to tack, water poured into the open gun ports. Once the ship began to heel, the heavy cannonballs and ballast slid to the starboard side, and gravity did the rest. The last recorded words of the ship's commander, Sir George Carew, which he called out to his uncle, Sir Gawain Carew, close by on the Matthew Gonson, were, quote, "I have the sort of knaves I can't rule," end quote. But the disaster was hardly the fault of the crew. From his vantage point on top of Southsea Castle, Henry VIII could only look on in horror as the ship where he had dined earlier that day keeled over and sank before his eyes, and comfort Lady Carew, who fell into a faint as she watched her husband sink to a certain death along with most of his crew. Most Tudor sailors did not know how to swim. It's fucking insane. It was thought unlucky and of little use, as ships were not in the habit of changing course to rescue those who fell overboard. Better to drown quickly. Those aboard the Mary Rose had the extra impediment of anti-boarding nets, which now kept the sailors in instead of keeping the enemy out. The loss of the Mary Rose was not a unique disaster. Just 2 weeks earlier, the French flagship, the Caraquan, had also sunk. If the Achilles' heel was the changeable weather, the French weakness was their stomachs. Before leaving Le Havre, the French king, Francis I, and his men, together with the ladies of the court, had eaten well over the course of several hours aboard the flagship. Late in the afternoon, a fire broke out in the galley. It spread rapidly to the gun deck, where the heat caused the loaded guns to explode, bombarding the surrounding vessels. The Caraquan took several down with her. In an almost farcical turn of events, the ship the Admiral Denabal chose as a replacement, La Maîtresse, also sank before she reached the Solent. As sinking ships were not altogether uncommon, there were men who specialized in recovering them. Despite the continuing threat of French invasion, Henry VIII lost no time in ordering that the Mary Rose be brought back up. The ship itself was valuable, but it was the loss of the guns that would be most costly. In 1552, it was estimated that the ordnance lost on the Mary Rose was worth £1,723, about £2 million today. A group of Venetian salvage operators, led by Petre de Andreas and Simon de Marin, were deployed in August 1545. Their team comprised 31 Venetians, one of whom was a carpenter, with some 60 English sailors supporting them. They required plenty of equipment: 50 pulleys, 60 ballast baskets, 40 pounds of tallow or animal fat, quote, "a great quantity of cordage of all sorts," end quote, and 2 large ships, the Samson and the Jesus of Lubeck, which were to be spared from the king's fighting force. The plan was to heave the Mary Rose upright by pulling on her masts, then run cables from the 2 larger ships under the hull and pull them taut, thus raising the vessel from the seabed to a level where she could then be pumped out and floated. Despite early optimism, the wreck proved beyond their expertise, and having broken the Mary Rose's mast, they called it a day. The fact that 35,904 pints of beer were consumed by the salvage team in less than a month, an expense duly billed to the crown, cannot have helped. While the Tudors avoided drinking water for fear of disease, and it was considered normal for a man to drink up to 8 pints of weak beer a day, the team had each consumed more than 14 pints a day while working on the project. Nonetheless, the ordnance was too precious to be left on the ocean floor, and once the French threat had receded, a smaller salvage operation began. Lord Admiral John Dudley, Viscount Lisle, hired Peter Paolo Corsi to bring up as much of the Mary Rose's valuable weaponry as possible. Corsi duly, quote, caused certain instruments to be made for the only intent and purpose, end quote, to retrieve, quote, certain gear, end quote, out of the Mary Rose. As well as equipment, the job required specialist divers. He assembled a team of 8 men, including Jacques Francis, John Eco, and George Bloch. Eco and Bloch may have also been of African origin, given their names and their diving skills. Corsi was now on the royal payroll. In 1547, Edward Vaughan, captain at Portsmouth, was reimbursed by the Treasury for marine causes for £37, 11 shillings and 5 pence. He'd paid Corsi for the recovery of, quote, certain anchors and ordnance out of the Mary Rose, end quote. The Register of the Privy Council records further payments made to Corsi, £20 via Sir John Williams on the 17th of May, 1547, and £50 by Mr. Carew on the 3rd of August, 1549. This was not, of course, the George Carew who drowned in the Mary Rose, but Sir Wymond Carew, treasurer of the First Fruits and Tenths. The money Carew paid to Corsi had been, quote, impressed of the relief of spirituality, end quote. That is, it came from a clerical tax revenue that had previously enriched the Pope, but was redirected into the royal coffers by Thomas Cromwell in 1534. The total cost of the salvage attempts over 4 years, from 1545, when the Rosemary sank, until 1549, when Carew made the final payment, amounted to nearly £560, about a fifth of what was paid to Corsi, who, with his team, had succeeded in taking certain guns out of the ship drowned, end quote. The Mary Rose was not the only wreck Jacques Francis and Corsi's team worked on during this period. On St. Martin's Day, 11th of November, 1546, the Sancta Maria and Sanctus Edwardus suffered a, quote, great mischance, end quote. She had set sail from Southampton bound for the Italian ports of Livorno, Messina, and Venice, laden with the typical exports of woolen clothing, kerseys, woolen cloth, and Cornish tin, plus cottons, leather, and lead. Before she left Southampton water, a fire broke out on board, and the ship sank some 2 miles from the shore. The Sancta Maria and Sanctus Edwardus belonged to Francesco Bernardi of Venice, but she was carrying merchandise belonging to various prominent Italian merchants. One was Domenico Rizzo, who had been elected consul of the Venetians in London in 1533. Florentine Bartholomew Fortini, who had made a fortune supplying the king with saltpetre and brimstone for the royal arsenal, also had goods on board. Another, Niccolo Marini, came from a large mercantile family with business interests in Southampton. He was born in Westhall, one of the town's largest mansions, in 1509, but went back to Genoa as a boy and grew up there before returning to his birthplace in 1526, aged 17. A fourth, Angelo de Milanus, was originally from Florence. These men were all anxious to recoup what they could of the goods lost when the ship went down. Nothing could be done in the immediate aftermath of the shipwreck due to the weather. Diving was a seasonal business. Francis himself said that the month of May was the best time for salvage work, while Orizio commented that winter, quote, was ever too cold and out of fashion in season, end quote. The merchants hired Pier Paolo Corsi and his team to bring up the lost goods for the following summer. For the months of July, August, and September of 1547, they were paid 2 shillings and 4 pence a day, and the cost of their, quote, victualling, end quote, that is, their food and drink, was also covered. These meals, which included the luxury of meat, were taken at the Dolphin Inn, the principal inn of the town, which is still in business today. As the summer drew to an end, a lack of results caused relations with their employers to sour. Around Michaelmas, 29th of September, Corsi was detained and taken before the mayor of Southampton, Thomas Beckenham. He was accused by two of the merchants, Domenico Arezzo and Bartholomew Fortini, of stealing their goods from the wreck of the Sancta Maria and Sanctus Eduardus. It was alleged that Corsi and his team went, quote, craftily in the night time, end quote, and stole 2 pieces of tin worth at least 20 pounds together, out of the wreck, one belonging to Arezzo and the other to Fortini. Corsi had, they claimed, then stashed 1 piece of tin under a bed in one Mr. Pope's house in Gosport, near Portsmouth, where the whereabouts of the tin was reported to Niccolo de Marini, the Genoese merchant who had also lost goods aboard the ship, and he sent a servant to retrieve it. Quote, after many words, end quote, with Mr. Pope, the servant found the piece of tin and carried it to the house of Edward Vaughan, the captain of Portsmouth. Vaughan was, of course, already acquainted with Corsi, having paid him on the government's behalf for his labors on the Mary Rose. It seems he had developed a rapport with the diving operator, because when Corsi claimed he'd simply found the tin on the seabed away from the wreck, Vaughan took him at his word. In an act so brazen as to verge on utter recklessness, Corsi then took 1 piece of tin to the Florentine merchant Angelo Milanes's house to see if he could get a reward for it. Milanes restored the tin to its rightful owner, Fortini, who offered Corsi a finder's fee of 20 shillings. Corsi complained that this was not enough, so Fortini and Arezzo joined forces to have him arrested. It transpired that he had in his possession a second piece of tin marked with Arezzo's initials, D.E., and the mayor of Southampton ordered him to return it immediately to its rightful owner. When confronted with his crime, Corsi did not deny it. He only averred that his wages were too little for him and his servants, and so he felt justified in keeping some of the salvaged goods for himself. He was later overheard at the Dolphin Tavern exclaiming that if he had taken 2 or 3 pieces more of tin, it still would not have been enough. Corsi was not detained long. Mayor Thomas Beckenham recalled he was, quote, still at his liberty and not stopped one day, end quote. It was Angelo de Milanes, of all people, who secured Corsi's freedom. Vouching for a suspected thief suggests Corsi's salvaging services were simply indispensable. Soon afterwards, Corsi, fearing that he would be further troubled in Southampton for stealing the tin, came to London and obtained letters missive addressed to the mayor of Southampton, that Thomas Seymour, the Lord Admiral, which stated that he, quote, should not be at any time troubled, but permitted to pass quietly without vexation, end quote. His work for the Crown in salvaging the Mary Rose took precedence over any other considerations. He must be free to continue. Arezzo was clearly not satisfied by how things had gone in Southampton. He may have had his tin returned, but Corsi had evaded any serious punishment. In December 1547, the Venetian merchant took his case to the High Court of Admiralty, which met in St. Margaret's Hill, London, south of the river, close to today's Borough Market. The case rumbled on for 2 years, and many men gave testimony, merchants and sailors from Southampton, Venice, and Florence, and from other parts of England, such as London and Devon. Jock Francis testified on Wednesday, 8th of February, 1548. He did not speak English very well, and so the court appointed an interpreter named John Tyrart to translate his words. What language did they converse in? Francis would have needed some means of communicating with his fellow divers and their Venetian master. Given the Portuguese presence in West Africa, Francis may well have spoken their language, albeit in some pidgin form, intermingled with his mother tongue. The court record gives no further information about Tyrart, but there was a vintner or wine merchant of that name living in Blackfriars, London, in 1554. Maybe Tyrart had picked up some Portuguese whilst importing wine. It was not unusual for merchants to act as interpreters for the court, usually as an informal favor to someone they knew who was involved in the case. Excuse me. These allergies are out of control. Through Tyrart, Francis explained that he was a member of Corsi's household and that he had known the Venetian for 2 years. He stated that he was about 20 years old and had been born in Insula de Guinea, or an island off Guinea. This could refer to any one of the large number of tiny islands off the West African coast, including the Cape Verde Islands, Fernando Po, Sao Tome, and Principe. I don't know if I'm pronouncing any of them right, but the most likely candidate is Arguin, off Mauritania, where the Portuguese had built their first African trading fort. The island's treacherous waters wrecked many ships, making it a plausible birthplace and training ground for a salvage diver. Francis had known Arezzo for about 7 months, since the team had been hired to dive the Sancta Maria and Sanctus Eduardus wreck the previous July. The fact that he, of all of Corsi's team of divers, was singled out to give testimony suggests that he was the most senior. Francis did his best to defend his master from the accusations leveled against him. According to his evidence, the team, quote, chanced to find in the sea at the Needles 200 blocks of tin, a bell, and some lead. The Needles, a series of rocks just off the most westerly tip of the Isle of Wight, was the site of many shipwrecks, and so a plausible location for such a discovery. They had, Francis claimed, found these items around Easter 1547, a few months before Corsi was commissioned to dive the Sancta Maria and Sanctus Eduardus. He also attested that Arezzo had caused his master to be detained for the whole month of May to Corsi's great cost. He spent about 300 crowns on the, quote, instruments and victuals, end quote, required to bring up the goods he had discovered, which subsequently went unused during the best time of year for diving work, and 700 pounds worth of treasure remained on the seabed. Francis was adamant that Corsi had been falsely accused. Perhaps Francis and Corsi thought that if they could show that Arezzo had arrested him under false pretenses, they might have a compensation claim against him. Francis's assertion that Corsi had been detained throughout May 1547 is in complete contradiction of the accounts given by a host of other witnesses, who all said he was arrested for no more than a day or two at the end of September. Could Francis have tried to backdate and extend the length of the arrest to make it seem as if Corsi had really suffered at the merchant's hands? Jacques Francis's testimony demonstrates how good a diver he was. He was able to stay deep underwater long enough to, quote, handle and see, bracket, the tin, a bell, and the lead, end bracket, being there perished and forsaken, end quote. To salvage heavy objects from the seabed, Francis must have mastered the art of free diving, that is, diving without any breathing apparatus. Still practiced today, this requires years of training from an early age to develop the necessary lung capacity and mental strength, and to learn how to equalize the pressure in one's ears and breathe effectively. One can paint a vivid picture of Francis as a child growing up on a West African land, learning to swim and dive from his parents and friends. The people of that region were said to be, quote, the most expert swimmers in the world, end quote, as Robert Baker and 8 other Englishmen found when they were saved from a shipwreck on the Gold Coast in 1568. They used their diving ability to gather valuable currency. In Congo, the women dived for cowrie shells, while gold was brought up from the Ankobra riverbed in modern Ghana. Their aquatic skills could also be used for nefarious purposes. While on the coast of modern-day Liberia, between 1599 and 1600, Johann von Lubelfing, a German soldier in Dutch employ, witnessed a theft by an adept African diver. Quote, "They can swim well below the water like a fish, as they proved there. One of them, who had a pewter tankard of beer in his hand and a soldier's helmet on his head, jumped into the water with them and swam thus great distance under water. Then he re-emerged and jumped into his little boat, which his companion had to bring to him. Thus he got away with the helmet and tankard, and no one could overtake him." Francis's swimming and diving would have been equally impressive to the people of Southampton, as they were not skills known to the average Englishman, even sailors and port dwellers. When Everard Digby published a treatise on the art of swimming in 1587, he had to illustrate it heavily to demonstrate the necessary strokes. Swimming was generally considered dangerous. Quote, "Perilous Pond," end quote, north of Bunhill Fields in London, got its name because so many people drowned there. The Vice-Chancellor of Cambridge forbade his scholars from swimming there in 1571, with penalties including whipping, fines being set in the stocks, and expulsion for those caught twice. In his youth, the diplomat and writer Lord Edward Herbert of Cherbury's mother made him promise never to swim, for, quote, "she had heard of more drowned than saved by it," end quote. Even if one didn't drown, immersing oneself in water was generally viewed with suspicion. The royal physician Andrew Boord wrote that bathing, quote, "allowed the venomous airs to enter and destroyeth the lively spirits in man and enfeebleth the body," end quote. As most Renaissance Europeans were unable to swim, the free diving skills of Africans such as Francis were admired and prized across Europe and the Atlantic world. A 1500 painting of Gentile Bellini, Miracle of the Cross at the bridge of San Lorenzo, shows an African about to jump into a Venetian canal. In Genoa, Cardinal Bandinello Soli employed an African as a swimming and diving instructor. Ferdinando I de' Medici was saved from drowning in the river Arno in 1588 by, quote, "a Negro of his, very notable swimmer." Quote, "a Negro of his, a very notable swimmer," end quote. That didn't sound like it came out correct. When Richard Hawkins visited the Spanish pearl fishery at La Margarita off the northeast coast of Venezuela in 1593, he observed that the Africans deployed there were, quote, "expert swimmers and great divers," end quote, who over time and with, quote, continual practice, end quote, had learned to hold their breath long underwater for the better achieving their work, end quote. Peter de Maurice, a Dutchman who traveled to the Gold Coast in 1602, noted that Venezuelan slaveholders sought men from that specific area to employ as pearl divers, as they were, quote, "very fast swimmers and can keep themselves underwater for a long time. They can dive amazingly far, no less deep, and can see underwater," end quote. As well as diving for pearls, Africans were employed in salvage operations. In September 1622, 28 Spanish ships were wrecked by a hurricane the day after they left Havana. 20 enslaved divers were sent to recover the silver and other goods aboard. Their master, Francisco Núñez Melian, inspired them in their work by promising freedom to the first man to discover a wreck. In due course, one of them found the remains of the Santa Margarita and was set free. The English were also beginning to exploit this expertise. On Edward Fenton's abortive 1582 voyage to the East Indies, it was a, quote, Negro, end quote, who dived to retrieve the Edward's lost anchor and cables. In 1622, 2 black indentured servants were paid for salvage operations on an English ship that was lost near Bermuda. The association became axiomatic. In George Chapman's 1596 play, The Blind Beggar of Alexandria, a character named Egial says he, quote, he will, quote, more like learn to swim and dive into the bottom of the sea, end quote. In the course of Corsi's trial, some called to testify spoke of the Venetian himself diving into the water. John Westcott, a London merchant, said he saw him, quote, dive under the water with certain instruments, end quote, while William Musson, a sailor aboard Westcott's ship, said he saw him, quote, in the water, end quote. Could he too have mastered the art of free diving, or was he merely able to swim, enabling him to help collect the recovered goods when they reached the surface? A Venetian was certainly more likely to be able to dive than an Englishman. We know that Greeks and southern Italians were diving for sponges in this period. Corsi may have been able to dive to about 25 to 30 feet. This is the threshold at which divers need to equalize the pressure in their ears. Failure to do this is very painful and can result in ruptured eardrums and damaged sinuses, manifested as bleeding from ears, nose, and even the eyes. Francis would have known how to equalize and was able to dive as deep as 90 feet. If Corsi's diving team was structured in a similar way to that of the Spanish pearl diving teams, then we can imagine the Venetian as the patron or owner of the boat who employed a team of half a dozen divers led by an African expert. Clearly, such men had to be treated well. If you wanted someone to be able to dive regularly, he had to be kept in peak physical condition. In this context, Corsi's purchase of meat and drink at the Dolphin was a necessary investment in his skilled employees. What were the, quote, certain instruments, end quote, that Corsi's team used? Leonardo da Vinci had designed various underwater breathing devices for the Venetian state in the early 16th century, one of which he claimed would allow a man to stay submerged for 4 hours. But fearful of the, quote, evil nature of man, end quote, he refused to test or even reveal his designs in case they were used, quote, as a means of murder at the bottom of the sea, by breaking the bottoms of ships and sinking them altogether with the men in them, end quote. The development of modern diving equipment began in the 19th century. In 1818, a young diver named John Dean was present when a fire broke out at a farmhouse near Whitstable in Kent. He seized a helmet from an old suit of armor and used a pump and hose to supply it with oxygen, while he saved the horses from a burning barn. He and his brother Charles Anthony patented his invention and later developed it into a diving helmet. In 1836, they would use their invention to rediscover the wreck of the Mary Rose. One useful piece of equipment available to Corsi's team, at least in a rudimentary form, was the diving bell. This captured a pocket of air as the divers descended, allowing them to breathe from this reserve at certain intervals instead of returning to the surface. Guglielmo de Lorena and Francesco de' Marchi had employed such a device in 1535 to explore and retrieve items from Caligula's pleasure barges submerged in Lake Nemi near Rome. As well as the diving bell, divers used a technique where they tied 2 large stones together with cord and slung them over their shoulders. As they entered the water, this weighed them down sufficiently to reach the depths and could be discarded when they wanted to return to the surface. As divers came up and down several times in a session, they required a good store of such stones and cord in their boat. Regularly diving from an early age would naturally improve their ability to see underwater. Glass or bamboo goggles were available, although these became less useful at greater depths as the water pressure pressed them painfully against the face. The testimony of Domenico Pazza, a 31-year-old from Verona, who found himself aboard Corsi's salvaging boat, provides us with an insight into how Francis and his team brought the tin to the surface. Corsi had tied a rope around a piece of tin. Pazza had given it a tug, and the rope had broken. The angry Corsi chastised Pazza for having, quote, done ill to meddle with that which he had taken in hand, end quote. 3 of the 15 witnesses in the case questioned Francis's testimony when they were recalled to give further evidence in late May and early June 1549. Antonio de Niccolò, a 32-year-old Venetian sailor resident in Southampton, declared Francis was, quote, a Morsico, born where they are not christened, and slave to the said Peter Paolo, Corsi, end quote. And that, quote, no credit nor faith ought to be given to his sayings, as in other strange, foreign, Christian countries, it is to no such slave given, end quote. Nicola de Marini, the Genoese merchant who had lost goods aboard the sunken ship, pronounced Francis a, quote, Morsico, who, had been for the space of 3 years slave and bondman to the said Peter Paolo, and an infidel born, and so is commonly reputed and taken of all men knowing him, end quote. At the end of his testimony, he emphasized that, quote, no faith ought to be given to the sayings of the same Blackmore, for that he is slave to the same Peter Corsi, and an infidel born, end quote. Finally, Domenico Milanis, factor to, and possibly a relative of fellow Florentine Angelo de Milanis, said Francis was a, quote, Gino, Guinean, end born where they are not christened, and hath been for these 2 years slave and bondman to the said Peter Paolo, Corsi, end wherefore he thinks that no credit should be given to his sayings or depositions, end quote. These 3 statements are so similar that they sound like they had been planned in advance, that the men got together and discussed how to pour doubt on Francis's unhelpful testimony. There are 3 interesting issues here. First, what was Francis's geographical origin? Second, what was his religious status? And finally, was he enslaved? Unfortunately, the description of Francis as a, quote, Morsico, end quote, doesn't give us any further information about precisely where he came from. The term was only rarely used to describe individuals in Tudor England, but it occasionally appeared as a place name. Thomas Eliot, discussing the Roman occupation of North Africa in his book named The Governor, or The Gouverneur, Gouernour, from 1531, commented that Roman, quote, Numidia, Libya, and such other countries now be called Barbary and Morisco. End quote. Quote, Morisco, end quote, was also used to signify Morocco in 1597 London Parish Register, as we shall see in Chapter 6. However, Francis himself testified that he was born on an island off the coast of Guinea, not Morocco. The term, quote, Morisco, end quote, might also have had some religious significance. It was used by the Spanish to describe Moorish converts to Christianity, of which there had been many since the Spanish retook Granada in 1492. In the description of, quote, Robert Tago, a Morsico servant with Thomas Caslin, end quote, who is living in Vintry Ward, London in 1567, this is the meaning that makes most sense. quote, Castellan, end quote, suggests, quote, Castilian, end quote. So Tago was probably a Moorish convert to Christianity brought from Spain to England by his master. Jacques Francis was allegedly, quote, an infidel, end quote, quote, an infidel, end quote, born, quote, where they are not christened, end quote. Certainly there was a substantial Muslim population in West Africa around the time of his birth, but the term, quote, Morisco, end quote, together with his, quote, Christian, end quote, name, suggests that Francis had subsequently been baptized. Quite apart from anything else, the High Court of Admiralty would not have accepted his testimony were he were unable to convince it of his Christian status and swear an oath on the Bible to tell the truth. There was no reason why Corsi or another European had met en route to Southampton. There was no reason why Corsi or another European he had met en route to Southampton could not have arranged for Francis to be baptized. The Bible tells of a, quote, man of Ethiopia, end quote, treasurer to Queen Candace, who was converted and baptized by Philip on the road to Jerusalem. This example was followed by Europeans throughout the Renaissance period. In 1520, Pope Leo X baptized the writer Al-Hassan ibn Muhammad al-Wazan al-Fassi, naming him Leo Africanus. 80 years later, Africanus' English translator, John Pori, was so impressed with Portuguese missionary work in Congo and Angola that he wrote of the, quote, exceeding glory, end quote, which they had, quote, no less advanced the honor of their own nation than the propagating of the Christian faith, end quote. So Francis was presumably a Christian by 1549, and the three witnesses were ignoring this in their efforts to discredit the testimony of the only witness who supported Corsi's side of the argument. It is interesting to consider that Francis might have been born into a Muslim family, and later converted either by Corsi or one of his countrymen. He would then have been a Catholic, a status that would become increasingly troublesome for him in Reformation England. With the succession of the young Edward VI in 1547 came the evangelical Protestantism and the first Book of Common Prayer in England, use of which was enforced under the Act of Uniformity from the 9th of June, 1549. What of the assertion that Francis was a slave? Antonio de Nicolao, or Nicolao, claimed that Corsi had offered to sell his lead diver to anybody who wanted to buy him, but none of the people of Southampton stepped forward to buy him that day. Such a transaction would of course have been illegal. In his testimony, De Marini insisted Francis was, quote, commonly reputed, end quote, to be a slave and taken as such by all who knew him. Even if this were true, it doesn't change the fact that it was not legally possible to be enslaved under English common law. This was in stark contrast to the laws the Italians were familiar with at home. In Venice, the Senate had decreed in 1489 that anyone who killed a runaway, quote, Ethiopian or Saracen, end quote, slave would be immune from prosecution for murder. We can see Antonio de Nicolao's confusion in his pains to point out to the court that, quote, in other strange countries, end quote, the right to testify, quote, is to no such slaves given, end quote. However, Francis was not a slave in England. The clash of jurisdictions is a common theme when members of a foreign merchant's household. Sorry, let me check I'm still recording. The clash of jurisdiction is a common theme when members of a foreign merchant's household appear in English courts. When Venetian Filippo Cini tried to sell his servant Maria Moriana to a Genoese merchant for £20 in Southampton in the 1470s, she protested her freedom. Not to be thwarted, Cini made her sign a document she was unable to read, certifying that she owed him £20 before having her thrown into prison. She petitioned the Lord Chancellor, asking him to redress this gross injustice, but his response does not survive. Cini thought he could treat Maria as a slave in England, as he could at home in Italy, but she was aware that he could not. More than a century later, Hector Nunes, a Portuguese physician and converso, the name given to former Jews ostensibly converted to Christianity, who also appeared to believe the laws of slavery were the same in England as in his native land. He had illegally purchased a quote, Ethiopian Negar, Negar, end quote, from a Cornish mariner in 1587, but was soon afterwards forced to acknowledge that the common law of England did not allow him to compel the man to, quote, tarry and serve, end quote, him. Although slavery was illegal, it may still have been practiced, especially in foreign households, where they were used to other customs. In 1537, Diego Sanchez, a Spaniard living in the parish of St. Benet's in the city of London, named, quote, Johann Joan, and my slave, end quote, in his will. She may not have been of African origin, as her ethnicity is not mentioned, and as we've seen, Africans were not the only peoples to be enslaved in Europe. Sanchez left instructions that Johann should serve his wife, Eleanor de la Palma, for 2 years after his death, after which she would be freed and given clothes and 4 ducats of gold. Johann's 2 daughters, maybe it's in Spanish, it's not Johann, maybe it's Johan's 2 daughters, Agnes and Mary, who had been fathered by Sanchez, were left a dowry on their marriages of 10,000 maravedis each. This was to be paid in, quote, household stuff, end quote, which would be, quote, a remembrance to them to pray for me, end quote. Sanchez does not appear to have lived very long in London, where he says he is living, quote, at this present time, end quote, and he makes his provision, quote, if God do take me out of this present life in this realm of England, end quote. He also had the will written in Spanish so his heirs and friends could read it. It appears Sanchez brought Johann with him from Spain and continued to treat her as a slave in England. Nothing existed in English law that could have compelled Johann to continue to serve Sanchez's wife after he died, but she may have done so. She is the only person known to be described as a slave in a Tudor will, no doubt because the will was made by a Spaniard resident in London. As we shall see in Chapter 10, when Englishmen and women mentioned Africans in their wills, they appeared not as slaves, but as beneficiaries. One strong indicator that Jacques Francis was not enslaved is that various witnesses in the High Court of Admiralty case make reference to him being paid wages. Antonio de Nicolao described Francis and the other divers as, quote, poor laboring men seeking their living about in sundry places where they may get it having but little of their own, end quote. This description does not sound like that of enslaved men. The men, though poor, seem to have had the freedom to work for whom they pleased. Nicolo, sorry, I don't know how to pronounce his name, but it's Nicolao. Nicolao. So I don't know if it's Nicolao, but let's say Nicolao, I guess. Nicolao himself had observed them doing other work, perhaps work during the times of the year when the weather prohibited diving. Perhaps they worked in the docks loading and unloading goods. Even if Francis had, quote, little of his own, end quote, the possession of anything at all, and more importantly, the fact that he was earning his living shows that he was not enslaved. Domenico Erizo, testified that in October and November 1547, he had seen Corsi, quote, walk up and down in the street, in a long gown, being in variance with a servant of his, for that he denied to pay his wages, end quote. This is further evidence that Francis and the other divers were, at least in theory, receiving wages. Corsi had told the mayor of Southampton that he had stolen the tin because the wages he and his servants were being paid were too low. This raises the possibility that the fight in the street was below because his servants wanted more money and he was driven to the theft to satisfy their demands. Our interpretation depends on how we imagine the balance of power between Corsi and his divers. Given their unrivaled skills, Corsi's team were actually in a pretty strong negotiating position should they have wished to make demands of their master. He would find it difficult to replace them. Others might have regarded him as a slave, but how did Francis see himself? He gave evidence of, quote, his own free will, end quote. He gave evidence, quote, of his own free will, end quote. According to John Tyrard, the court interpreter, Francis asserted that he was a, quote, famulus, end quote, to the Venetian. Famulus meant a servant or attendant, a member of someone's entourage or household, in contrast to servus, meaning slave. Tyrard, and by extension the court, accepted and recorded this term when Francis used it to identify himself. While Francis may not have had a clear idea of his status in England before the court case, the experience of testifying showed him that he was considered free in the eyes of the law. It's quite possible that this understanding began to dawn on him the day that Corsi offered to sell him in Southampton and got no response. That Francis was allowed to testify in an English court of law is powerful evidence that he was not considered a slave. Enslaved or unfree, people have been prevented from testifying throughout history, partly due to the concern they would be forced by their circumstances to say whatever their masters told them to say. Roman law stated that slaves could not give evidence unless it was taken under torture. Jesus Christ. The villeins or serfs of medieval England could not give evidence in court. As late as the 1530s, the Duke of Suffolk was brought before the Court of Chancery to represent one of his villeins from his Suffolk manor of Frostenton, the man not being allowed to speak for himself. In the early years of the American colonies, slaves were able to give testimony, but once their slave status was confirmed, this right was removed. In 1732, the state of Virginia declared that black men and women, quote, are people of such base and corrupt natures that their testimony cannot be certainly depended on, end quote. Yet English courts were to depend on the testimony of Africans on more than one occasion in the century following Francis's appearance. And as we shall see in Chapter 4, Edward Swarthy, I don't know if I'm saying that right, Swarthye, like Francis, gave evidence in support of his employer, but not all African witnesses did. In 1609, the pirate William Longcastle, quote, a man of evil fame and little or no substance, end quote, was put on trial in the High Court of Admiralty. His alleged crime was seizing the Suzanne of Bristol off the coast of Morocco. According to the prosecution, Longcastle had come alongside the Susan as she lay close to the port of Safi and invited most of her crew aboard his ship, the Ulysses, quote, to banquet and revel, end quote. While they were being entertained, he captured the ship and made off with her to the West Indies. But the main witness to the crime, Captain Anthony Y., master of the Susan, was absent at sea when the case came to trial, and so it looked as if Longcastle would be acquitted. However, Longcastle had made a fatal error. He had, in his, quote, rashness to surprise and haste to get off, end quote, left an African boy behind at the scene of the crime. Y took the boy back to England, and with him, where he left him at the home of a London merchant, Richard Hall, the owner of Longcastle's ship, the Ulysses. The boy was brought into court and convincingly testified against Longcastle, the pirate, in words that strongly echo the complaints of the Italian merchants in 1549, begged the judges to, quote, "let the tongue of a Christian and not of a pagan cut off my life," end quote. It was a plea made in vain, for Longcastle had compounded his error in leaving the boy behind by having him christened. Quote, "The court resolved that where he desired to have the oath of a Christian," sorry, I'm spacing out. The pirate, in words that strongly echo the complaints of the Italian merchants in 1549, begged the judges to, quote, "let the tongue of a Christian and not a pagan cut off my life," end quote. It was a plea made in vain, for Longcastle had compounded his error in leaving the boy behind by having him christened. Quote, "the court resolved that where he desired to have the oath of a Christian, bracket he, and bracket himself, and the Moor, had confessed he had made him one," end quote. The boy might have been purchased as a slave abroad, but in England he was free, and as a Christian he could testify against his former master. Longcastle and his accomplices were found guilty and sentenced to death. They were executed at Wapping in December 1609. In accusing Francis of being an infidel and a slave, the Italians were being disingenuous. They attacked him not because of his heritage, but because his evidence in his master's defense went against their interest. However vitriolic and xenophobic the Italians' words about Francis were, we must remember that they were said in court in a failed attempt to discredit him, and he was not the only witness whose testimony was questioned in this way. In March 1549, an agent of Domenico Arezzo asked the court to disregard the testimony of 4 others: John Westcott, William Musson, John Eco, and George Blacke. Blacke. Not only did he accuse them of being unfit witnesses partial to Corsi, but he also asserted that they were, quote, "unhealthy, of capricious opinions, living corrupted lives, poor and needy vagabonds," end quote. The list goes on, as if the lawyers were reeling off every conceivable objection to a witness. Most striking are the accusations that these men were, quote, vagabonds, wandering through different places and kingdoms all over the world, end quote, who were, quote, "without faith, infidels and pagans, by no means professing the Christian religion," end quote. The latter strongly echoes the accusation made against Jacques Francis, and his name is not listed in the document. The objections do, however, confirm our suspicions that Eco and Bloch, like Francis, had learnt their diving skills in their native Africa. It is odd that 2 Englishmen, Westcott, originally from Barnstaple in Devon, and Musson, a Warwickshire man, are listed alongside the divers, as their accounts supported Arezzo's own. It may simply be that the objections against all 4 men were simply lumped together in one document to minimize the cost of paperwork. We do not know whether Francis's testimony was enough to exonerate his master, as the verdict does not survive. In any case, it wasn't long before Corsi found himself imprisoned for a different offense. In September 1549, Henry Fitzalan, Earl of Arundel, persuaded Corsi to leave Portsmouth to, quote, "take certain of his stuff out of the sea," end quote. Corsi and his team duly set off for Arundel Castle, some 30 miles east along the coast. The Duke of Somerset regarded this as Corsi abandoning his work on the Mary Rose and had him committed to the Tower. Corsi was examined by Sir Edward Wotton, Wotton, who had been on the Privy Council since 1547. Wotton clearly found fault, as Corsi remained incarcerated for the next 6 months. He was finally released on the 26th of March 1550 without having to pay any fees for his imprisonment. This was a boon, as prisoners usually faced a bill for board and lodging. After his stint in the Tower, Corsi may no longer have been in a position to employ Jacques Francis. Yet his team's services had been called upon by the king, Arezzo and his fellow merchants, and the Earl of Arundel in quick succession. With such high demand for salvage expertise, surely Francis could name his price. The Sancta Maria and Sanctus Eduardus case had made him enemies amongst the merchant population of Southampton and even London. That said, his loyalty to his master should have recommended him to other employers. He might even have international employment prospects. In 1569, Francisco Gonzalez, a free African diver living in Seville, requested a license to travel with his wife to Veracruz in New Spain, where he intended to continue plying his trade. Such journeys would have been fraught with dangers, not least the very real threat of enslavement, and so it would hardly be surprising if Francis had chosen to remain in England. Jacques Francis was not the last African to live in Southampton in the Tudor era. By the end of the 16th century, a number of Africans were living in the households of English merchants and townspeople. We know this because they were subject to a, quote, alien, end quote, poll tax of 3d. a head, levied on any foreigner living in England. The tax returns for Southampton show that between 1594 and 1611 there were as many as 10 Africans resident in 12 different households, the majority of which were those of wealthy merchants within the parishes of Holy Rood, St. Lawrence, St. Michael, and St. John. Four of the men with African servants named as mayor of Southampton, Four of the men with African servants served as mayor of Southampton. Two were members of Parliament, two had connections with Dolphin Inn. John Sedgwick was the innkeeper in the 1580s, while John Jeffrey had become the owner before 1611. Three of the Africans were recorded by name: Joan, maid to Lawrence and Mary Gross; Maudlin, who lived in the household of John Andrews; and Michael, servant to Mayor Thomas Holmes. In July 1591, Michael and another African servant to Thomas Heaton were accused of theft by an alehouse keeper, Dennis Edwards. They were sent to prison on suspicion of cutting and stealing a cable from his ship. No further charge was made against them, and they were, quote, punished in the stocks and so freed, end quote, despite protesting their innocence. As the numbers of Italian merchants in Southampton dwindled, English merchants began to take over the long-distance trades, traversing the seas as never before. From 1558, there was regular trade with Morocco, and from 1530, voyages began to venture further down to the coast of West Africa and across the Atlantic to South America and the Caribbean. This brought more Africans to English shores, where before they came via southern Europe. They now began to travel directly from Africa and the Atlantic world as a result of English privateering, which is why Africans begin to appear in Southampton records again in the 1590s. One Englishman who made a career of seizing Spanish ships and raiding Spanish ports around the world was Sir Francis Drake. His exploits are well known, but few know the role played by Africans in his successes against the Spanish, or that some returned to England with him. Diego, who was to meet Drake in Panama, was one such man. And then the next chapter is about Diego. Alright, that's the end of the reading as you have to do for this upcoming assignment.